Welcome back to Access. I'm Ken.
And I'm Nicole.
And today we're doing James.
Woohoo! James! The Epistle of Straw.
Luther hated the Epistle of James and wished he could have gotten rid of it.
Right. And I gotta say, straw is useful. It keeps you warm, especially back in those days.
But it's weak. It's thin. It's like nothing.
Yeah, but have
He
you ever...
could have said like an epistle of nothing.
Right.
And that would have been more
But
like nothing.
if you bind up straw like in a collection, like in a book,
Then
it's quite
pretty
strong.
That's true. Well, Nicole, why don't
Okay.
you tell us a little bit about the history, why Luther might have hated the Book of James so much?
I don't know.
He just was cranky. Luther was cranky.
Well, James was one of the later books to be added to the canon, and everyone knows, or not everyone.
And everybody knew it.
That's common knowledge. It would have been common.
Oh, James come lately.
I know. Stupid straw. And Luther knew that. Like, the documents are there. So let's do a little bit of history of composition and authorship.
Bring it.
So there's two schools.
Two schools.
Now, there's one that says that it was written by James, the brother of Jesus. That's what it says it is in the book. We know that James, the brother of Jesus, was very active in the early church. We have it in Acts, we have it in Mark, we have it in quite a few places. And that's one camp of scholars. And
Did he like straw?
What?
Did he like straw? Do we know?
He worked with horses? I don't know, donkeys?
The manger?
Yes.
It all fits together.
True, he would have to be born quite a bit after that.
So what's the
Okay.
second school?
Okay, and for the dating for that, it would be no later than 62.
Alright.
Okay, and let me talk a little bit more about that school. And they think that it's from that school because it's dealing with a lot of the same issues as Paul, that the Greek is pretty good, and so they attribute that either to the fact that Palestine was thoroughly Hellenized by that time, which it was,
Sure.
or that it was written in Aramaic and then the translation cleaned it up.
Yeah.
Both make sense. And that it seems to be concerned with many of the same topics of Paul's letters. Now, for those same two reasons, other people put it written in the 2nd century, where they're like, well, it's dependent upon Paul. And that and that the Greek is too good.
Yeah.
So those are the two schools.
It is hard to believe. Like there's a lot of people talking about Jesus as a teknon. We say carpenter, but a teknon was probably a more skilled kind of worker. It's still hard to believe that they would be capable of incredibly well written Greek.
Right.
But
and that's why I tend to prefer the Aramaic translated.
yeah. Oh, I see.
You know, where the people who translated it
Had
are scholars, would have been scholars,
makes
and
sense.
in translation, you get to pick what words you use
Yeah.
and how you form it, class it up a bit,
Yeah.
you know. And I tend to be more in the Jesus brother or John brother of Jesus school.
It's a better story.
Well, it makes more sense
Yeah.
because the issues are very similar to Paul, which seems to indicate that it is a community grappling with the same issues. Where in the 2nd century, the books that come from there are much more concerned with the delayed parousia,
Right.
with
Coming of Christ.
that it hasn't
Parousia.
happened yet. They're much more concerned with false teachings.
Yeah.
Like, the concerns are different, where if this was in the 2nd century, it doesn't make sense,
All right.
like, for the community.
Cool.
So that puts me in the Luke Timothy Johnson camp.
Yay! He's a scholar and interpreter. We both like him.
He's at Emory, he's great.
Yeah.
So that's my own personal preference, but the other schools
Way
out
to go,
there,
LTJ.
and yeah, LTJ, awesome. And they have good reasons too, and in the end, it doesn't really matter, like who wrote it.
A ringing endorsement for academic work that Nicole's going into.
I'm going into history. I'm not going into clinical scholarship.
All right. Anything more on the history of James?
No, I didn't look into the history of reception.
No worries.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk a little bit about thematic content of James, and I'll touch a little bit more on why Luther might have hated the letter so much.
Oh, I know why he did.
I
was
know.
thinking it more in the theme.
Part of the major dominant theme that we get in the book of James, the reason why we love James so much, is be ye doers of the word and not merely hearers. So this is the original don't just talk the talk, but you gotta walk the walk. And James's community here, as far as we can tell, was like a nice, comfortable, mainline congregation.
Suburban.
that
on the Sea of Galilee.
They liked showing up
community.
on whenever they worshipped, and they liked hearing, what there was to hear. They particularly liked wearing nice clothes and putting their finest on. And then when Monday or Tuesday, whatever the day came, they're like, I don't really, we don't really care. The church is a nice thing. It's a pretty thing, but it didn't really change their lives. So James's overarching message is, don't just think that showing up and listening and saying with your mouth that you're a follower of Jesus is worth anything. But what are your feet doing? What are your hands doing? That is the measure of a disciple. The thing that particularly incenses Luther, though, is that James puts this really sharply. And he says at one point, can faith save you? And you can kind of hear the snarkiness in there, which, of course, we know from Paul and from Luther. We go, well, yes! But we'll talk about this in a little bit and realize, I think we'll all argue, and maybe you too, that what the book of James and all of Paul's letters, they're not talking about the same issue.
They're using same words in different ways.
Yeah, and they've got different concerns. So we'll look at that a little bit, but that's why initially it looks like Paul and James create this incredible opposition where Paul says you are saved by faith through grace, and then James says, can faith save you? No, it's your works. Come on. And then we'll look at a little bit of why they may be not arguing with each other, but talking and addressing different concerns. There's a lot of personal exhortation in the book of James about watching our speech, having careful speech, and there's worship issues at the end with prayer and healing. So it's a great book.
Yeah.
I think you've got. No, I've got Faith Without Works is Dead.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't think I do.
I'll slide right into that. Faith Without Works is dead. Like we say, it sounds like we're countering Paul, but here's the thing. What's Paul talking about when he talks about faith alone is what saves you? The works that Paul is talking about are the works of following the law. So things like becoming circumcised and not eating shrimp and having... And Paul says, none of that matters. Yeah. It's faith alone in Christ that matters, and whether you become circumcised or not, that doesn't add anything to it. It's irrelevant, is what it is.
Right.
Now, when James is talking about works, he's not talking about works of law. He's talking about all of the kindness and mercy and the fruits of the Spirit that a disciple ought to show. So in Paul's case, faith versus works, it's about whether you have to add on these cumbersome laws to just be a faithful person. And in James' case, it's, are you going to hear these things and say that you follow them and then not do anything? Yeah. Are you going to treat, for instance, in one case, he says, people come in who are dressed nicely. You treat them with respect. People come in, the homeless come in, and you spit on them. You look down on them. He says, that's not faith. No. And you can't just tell me, oh, we're saved, so we don't have to behave nicely.
Right.
So that's what James is getting at, is you can't just show up, you can't just show up, hold yourself out to be a disciple, and then not act like it. It's false. It's cheap grace.